Hello, and welcome back to the SIno-US podcast. On September 7th, 2020, President Donald Trump gave a speech in front of the White House in which he said,
"There's been no country anywhere at any time that's ripped us off like China has. We lose billions and billions of dollars for years and years, decades. So when you mention the word decouple, it's an interesting word. So we lose billions of dollars, and if we didn't do business with them, we wouldn't lose billions of dollars. It's called decoupling, so you'll start thinking about it. You'll start thinking. Under my administration, we will make America into the manufacturing superpower of the world, and we'll end our reliance on China once and for all. Whether it's decoupling or putting in massive tariffs like I've been doing already, we're going to end our reliance on China because we can't rely on China. And I don't want them building a military like they're building right now, and they're using our money to build it."
and following this speech, there was a lot of panic in the press, in the media, about the idea of decoupling from China. These articles started coming out like, is there going to be this historic break? Are all the supply chains going to have to reorient themselves? What is the political reality of this situation? Can we actually do this? Do we actually want to do this? What does it mean? Do people want to decouple from China? And then not long afterwards, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, said, actually, no, we're not doing that. We're not decoupling from China. Our relationship with China is one of the most intricate and important anywhere in the world, and how we manage it will be a determining factor for our future economic prosperity and national security. At the same time, we are concerned by what is behind the return to the global stage. Defining a European strategy towards China, defining what success looks like, must start with a sober assessment of our current relations of China and China's strategic intentions. Our relationship with China is too important to be put at risk by failing to clearly set the terms of a healthy engagement. It's clear that our relations have become more distant and more difficult in the last few years. I believe it's neither viable nor in Europe's best interest to decouple from China. Our relations are not black and white, and our response cannot be either. That's why we need to focus on de-risk, not decouple. China is a vital trading partner, accounting for 9% of our goods exports and more than 20% of our goods imports. While imbalances are growing, most of our trade in goods and services remain mutually beneficial and unrisky. But our relationship is unbalanced and increasingly affected by distortions created by China's state capitalist system. So we need to rebalance this relationship on the basis of transparency, predictability, and reciprocity. We have to ensure that our trade investment relations promote prosperity in China and in the European Union. There are many things to pick out from that statement, and I don't want to judge Ursula von der Leyen for being German and the fact that Germany would be the economy most at risk from a decoupling or de-risking whatever strategic situation from China. But needless to say that this is where the word de-risk emerges for the first time as opposed to the word decouple, and China is just not buying it at all, not one little bit. There is an editorial in the Global Times that says there's a sense that de-risking might be decoupling in disguise. De-risking or decoupling, Washington's strategic ambition has been consistent to satisfy its self-interest of security in the strategic competition with China and its unhealthy obsession with maintaining its dominant position in the world. Then China's Premier Li Qiang said at the WEF, or the World Economic Forum in Davos, that we should broadly open our minds, work closely together, abandon camp formations, and oppose decoupling. So in China, the idea is that de-risking and decoupling are actually the same things, and I hate to say it, but I agree with the Global Times. There is no difference other than semantic between de-risking and decoupling, so we don't need to focus on that. For this episode or the next few episodes, we're just going to be calling it decoupling. Something else that I wanted to pick out from what Ursula von der Leyen said, which kind of undergirds this entire episode, is the idea that China is only related to Europe through these not very risky sort of trade imbalances where you've got 9% exports, 20% imports, whatever it is. Those are what I like to think of as red herrings, namely they do not show the true picture of how deeply embedded China is into the global economic system at every single level. Trade is not the only way that Europe or the West or the US or whoever is connected to China. China is connected to these countries indirectly through other countries, also through supply chains. there's a lot going on, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because whether you're a car manufacturer or a food importer or a beauty brand, or you're just somebody who sells cardboard boxes, there is no decoupling from China. And de-risking, decoupling, deleting, whatever you want to call it, is just not possible with the way that the global economic system is set up right now. And if you were going to want to untether yourself end to end from every single thing that's connected to China, you'd be doing a lot of work yourself, let me tell you that for nothing. I think it's important to talk about this now because obviously since 2016 time has just been on a loop. So Donald Trump is president once again. You know, he made that speech in 2020 at the end of his presidency. Now he's starting a new term and he's essentially continuing the same track. His goals are still the same. He's already started talking about the tariffs that he wants to introduce on Chinese goods. So we know that his goals are going to be the same as they were. And the idea of turning the US into this great manufacturing hub again that's not reliant at all on anything to do with China is probably going to be another one of his talking points. It makes a good splashy headline to say something like that, but when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty and start talking about the realities on the ground, it's a lot more difficult than it seems. Also, just before we get into the main episode, another quick segue. Another reason why I think it's important to talk about this is because talking about things like trade imbalances and restricting imports from China and tariffs, that's how the first Opium War started. That was exactly the same conversation that people were having in the 19th century about how annoying China was. They were making too much money, basically. At that time it was the UK and a few other Western countries, but basically China was getting too big for its britches in the eyes of the major Western superpowers. We are back at exactly the same place once again. So we're going to divide this conversation into 3 different parts that kind of mirror how the economy is set up. In order to do that, I have to quickly explain what is the economy? How does the economy work? Okay, let's talk about that really quickly. So the economy, such as it is divided into 4 main sectors. You've got the primary sector, where companies are directly engaged in activities that involve extraction and the utilization of natural resources, so things like mining, agriculture, fishing, etc. The secondary sector sees companies using products derived from primary sector extraction to make goods in manufacturing. And then the tertiary, and I hate this word, quaternary sectors represent things like the service sector and the knowledge sector. So this is everything that's a service, so hotels, restaurants, deliveries, wholesale of goods and things like that. I've already kind of spoken about wholesale and China's role in wholesale on this podcast before, which you can go back and listen to if you want. Basically, what I want to do is kind of draw out in each of these sectors of the global economy how China is embedded in them. So I'm not talking about Chinese companies having, say, like a majority market share of, say, like global fishing or something like that. It's not that simple. And I think people want it to be that simple, where it's like, oh, well, we can just like start our own company and, you know, we'll take over that process. It's like, no. It's really not that straightforward. And I hope that I can convey that through the episode. How can I put this? This is not a critique episode, okay? It's not a commentary. It's barely even analysis, really. It's more like a listicle than anything else. Top 10 Chinese industries that dominate the global economic sector. I don't know what the tier list would look like, but basically what I'm trying to say is save your ire for a different episode, because I'm literally just going to be laying out facts. There may be the occasional comment or two just because certain things have to be said and certain disclaimers have to be made, but I've been yapping away now for over 10 minutes, so let's just get right into it. There's going to be no context, no historical background. If you want the historical background, I'm going to write about it on my Substack. Please also follow me over on Substack at SIno-US. Let's just get into it for this episode. Part 1, the primary sector. So like I mentioned, this is anything related to the extraction of natural resources. So I'm not going to go through every single industry within that sector because I know I love to talk, but we would be here for a very long time. So I'm just going to pick out 5. I think it's 5. Is it 5? 5 industries that we're going to talk about today. Part 1.1, agriculture. So China imports a lot of food. What a statement to make. China imports a lot of food, and by 2023, China was the largest importer of food in the world, with total food imports valued at 140 billion US dollars. Kind of, again, just like a little pin here, kind of interesting to note that the largest exporter of food to China is the US. I guess we can't let that trade war hurt the bottom line, but there you go. And so obviously at a consumption level, China is already very embedded in the global food system. But like I just mentioned, there has been a trade war, and in general, China has been thinking more about self-sufficiency basically since the beginning of the 21st century. So in 2010, the Minister of Agriculture, Han Chang-fu, warned that agricultural modernization was lagging too far behind industrialization and urbanization due to the lack of economic reward. He said that the time is ripe for the country's agricultural companies to embark on a go outward strategy, and so they did. So just to give an idea of what farming looks like in China right now, most farmers in China focus on cash crops, so things like fruits and vegetables, teas, things that have very high export value. If you look at any food in your house, sorry, that's too general, but like if you look at a lot of things like there was a big thing about lots of honey being produced in China recently. There was another thing that came out the other day about lots of Italian tomatoes actually being Chinese tomatoes. So already a lot of exported food comes from China. But I kind of want to talk about how China is embedded not from the export side of food, but actually from the import side of food, because I think this is slightly more interesting. It goes to a pattern of behaviour. China has to import most of its grain and its wheat because its farmers are doing cash crops for export. They're not growing food for the people per se. So where is it importing this food from? Or I think a better question might be, who is it importing this food from, right? The distinction here being that you may have a country of origin that says, say, Brazil or Mozambique or whatever, but are the companies in that country actually owned by people from that country, or are they, I don't know, maybe Chinese companies? I won't keep you in suspense. The answer is Chinese companies. So when I was digging into China's role in the global food system, I was quite surprised at the number of Chinese-owned farms around the world. Just some quick examples would be like the Black Rock Farm in Angola, which receives $100 million in funding as part of China's Development Bank's credit line. You have the One Bao Rice Farm in Mozambique, which is a beneficiary of the China Africa Development Fund, but is managed by a company called China Railway 20 Bureau Group Corporation, which is the most company-sounding company name ever. Like, what do you even do? That is a crazy company name. You've also got an agreement that was signed between the Ukrainian government and the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp, which is the part of the Chinese government that's in charge of running the entire Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And then you've got various land purchases across Latin America. Some of them are more like investment deals, so it's not per se a purchase of land by the Chinese government or a Chinese company. It's more of like an investment, but obviously that investment would require a return on that investment. And it's clear that China puts quite a lot of effort into maintaining these farms that it's invested a lot of money into. They train locals who work on the farms, and they also state that one of their goals is to help these farms and these farmers improve outputs and improve incomes for the local community first before exporting to China. And it's not just that these companies are buying land, it's that Chinese firms, Chinese universities, Chinese like research companies are actively inserting themselves into the agricultural supply chains, the agricultural development sectors of many of these regions that are so important to food security. So places like Rwanda, Nigeria, Angola. It's Chinese companies and Chinese scientists who are basically taking control of helping them develop new ways and new methods of growing crops. There have been some complaints about like lack of diversity, ruining crop yields, ruining biodiversity and things like that. Like I said, I'm not trying to do value judgments and stuff, but I just want to pinpoint certain issues that have arisen. And going back to the extraction thing, it's not just land, but it's also companies as well. There are so many companies out there that when I started getting into this, it honestly became like a rabbit hole of all of these companies that seemed to have strong ties with their home nation, or names that implied that they were, I don't know, maybe part of the government of a particular country, but were low-key owned by Chinese corporations. This one firm keeps coming back up over and over again, and I'm going to use them as an example. They're called COFCO, which is China National Cereals, Oil and Foodstuffs Corporation. And this is just a list of some of the firms that they own around the world. They took over the Australian company Tully Sugar in 2011, the Chilean winery Biscuit Vineyard, and the French wine producer Chateau de Viande in 2014. They own UK companies Grainseed and Criddle & Co., the Noble Agri Group, the failing Singaporean-based commodities house that signed a deal involving Noble's 4 sugar mills in Brazil, soybean crushing plants in Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay, grain silos in Ukraine, as well as Noble's network of ports and commodity terminals that are used to ship commodities to markets such as China. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. I've touched a little bit on the secondary and tertiary sectors. That's kind of unavoidable when you're talking about this sort of thing, because all of these things, the extraction, the manufacturing, and then the sending out of these manufactured goods as a service, are so deeply intertwined with one another because of the way that the global economy is set up and because of the way capitalist systems work, that of course COFCO owns the land as well as the sugar mill, as well as the ports where the sugar mill is exported from, you know? So just bear all of those things that I've discussed in mind as we're moving through this episode and the next episode as well, when thinking about what patterns emerge when we're talking about China's involvement in the global economy and whether or not it's possible to actually decouple. Okay, moving on to 1.2, fishing. I know nothing about fishing, but I thought this would be interesting to include because China is the world's largest seafood exporter, but again, much like agriculture, it's not how it seems on the surface. So in 2016, Chinese exports accounted for 14% of global seafood exports with a value of $20 billion US. These exports were shipped to over 160 countries. Furthermore, seafood exports are also important for China as they're the most important food group by export value. So what's interesting to note is that a lot of this exported seafood that China sends out to other countries is the result of re-exporting imports. So around 75% of seafood that China imports is then re-exported. So again, we're seeing how the primary sector, which is fishing, is immediately embedded and entwined with the secondary and tertiary sectors, which are turning that seafood into, say, a finished food product and then exporting it to other countries via China's shipping ports and wholesale companies. The top 15 species that China imports in seafood account for 3/4 of its total imports. Of that top 15, 5 of those are imported exclusively to export again. Among all the fin fish imported into China, 91% are whole frozen fish, product category that is typically further processed before the final point of sale. So again, it's not that China has the greatest market share or it processes all of the world's seafood or anything like that. It's about process and embeddedness. The majority of Chinese seafood imports for processing and re-export are wild caught. This largely contradicts the narrative that Chinese domestic demand is driving massive Chinese imports. Instead, Chinese processing of wild-caught fish for re-export outcompetes processing in other parts of the world in a way that resembles China's success in manufacturing more broadly. So China's fishing industry and the export of fishing seafood products is almost as important as China's manufacturing industry, bearing in mind that we have for decades referred to China as the manufacturing hub of the world. And I haven't even touched on the idea that many of the companies that are in other countries may or may not be Chinese owned, but I want to save that for the next section. So when we talk about mining these days, we're not talking about the halcyon days of gold and silver ore and panning for copper or whatever people used to do back in the day. We're talking about raw material supplies for batteries, basically, or the bits that make up your smartphone, things that go into chips, into processors, all those sorts of things. So 23% of the global supply of all battery raw materials is coming from China, with China responsible for 80% of battery grade raw materials. And by that, they mean not just the raw materials, but also turning those into things like anodes and, all the components that go into making the final battery or processor chip, whatever you are making at the end. Even though China domestically produces 23% of the materials from its own mining operations, here I want to focus more on where does China send its money abroad in order to have a greater stake in overseas mining operations. Indonesia is the world's largest nickel producer and also produces a significant amount of copper, cobalt, tin, and gold. And it's also the world's second largest producer of bauxite, which is used to create aluminium. So what's interesting about Indonesia is that they actually banned the exportation of bauxite. They were like, we need to keep all of this here because obviously if you export it and other people are refining it, they make all the money. So we need the refining capacity here in Indonesia. The problem was that they didn't have the money to actually finance the building of all of these refineries, right? That's where China comes in. So between 2019 and 2022, an investment of $10 billion into the refining industry in Indonesia, driven overwhelmingly by Chinese financing. Also, in general, Indonesia is the largest recipient of Chinese funding as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if we're talking about specifically nickel smelters, Chinese companies are responsible for building 90% of the nickel smelters in Indonesia. The story seems slightly different in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I do want to talk about how Chinese state-owned firms have exchanged foreign direct investment in exchange for direct access to copper and cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So studies have shown that between 2000 and 2016, China increased its ownership of cobalt imports to 29%, and China's global production share jumped from 2% to 14%, and its share of global refinery capacity rose from 3% to 50%. So a lot of these imports came from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And again, it shows the fact that a lot of the refining capacity, so this is again getting more into secondary industry, but again, I want to show the connection and the embeddedness here. It's not the fact that China controls these companies, it's more that it controls the flow and the supply of goods, right? China has invested money into these companies and into their mining operations, which then have an arrangement to send these products to China, which then get refined within Chinese refineries. As one article in the FT puts it, a new graphite facility will open in Malaysia as the world scrambles to break China's stranglehold on the industry. China actually dominates the whole world on graphite materials, said Aidan Lee, chief executive of GraphJet. And graphite is such a critical raw material for batteries. China produced the vast majority of the natural graphite and almost 70% of the world's synthetic graphite in 2022, according to Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Last October, Beijing imposed export controls on the material in response to US restrictions on technology sales to Chinese companies. The US has imposed new rules to force manufacturers to stop sourcing from China in the coming years, just as demand is expected to soar. But creating new supply chains almost from scratch is not easy. The chief executive of Albemarle, the world's largest lithium producer, warned last week that it was not economically viable to build a Western supply chain that could wrest control of critical minerals from China. The new facility in Malaysia will produce just 3,000 tons of graphite per year, just a fraction of China's vast 1.5 million ton capacity. Okay, pushing forward, part 1.4, forestry. Wood products are more important than I had first thought of. When I thought back to it, it was obvious, but just on the surface, I'm like, why would we care so much about forestry? But anyway, let's talk about China first. China's forest area and forest stock have expanded rapidly from 122 million hectares and 866 million meters squared in 1978 to about 200 million hectares and 1,544 million meters squared in 2015, increases of 70% and 78% respectively in 39 years. So it seems like China has a lot of wood. a lot of trees, a lot of capacity to produce wood, right? But at the same time, China is actually the world's largest importer of wood products or forest products. China began to trade in international markets in 1994. The total value of its trade in forest products rose to $150 billion by 2017. In the past 10 years, China has become the world's second largest consumer of timber and the largest timber importer. Overall, China imports around 55% of all wood products. Even if you were, say, a lumber company cutting down trees in whatever country you're in, and you're like, I don't want to deal with China anymore. Well, where else are you going to send your wood? You're going to send it to someone else who's probably going to send it to China, to be honest. China imports over half of all the world's wood because it then goes on to process them, again, moving into the secondary sector, but in order to make wood products that we use in our everyday lives. But here we are again, arriving at that age-old question, which is, if China is importing wood from 100 different countries around the world, who is in charge of the companies from whom China is importing this wood? Let's take a look and try and find out the answer together. The China Forestry Group Corporation, which is managed by the State Forestry Administration of the PRC, has operations around the world, including Canada, Myanmar, Brazil, and Singapore, and directly owns 24 forests across all of New Zealand, amounting to 22,000 hectares of plantation on around 29 hectares of land. 14 countries in Africa have received Chinese outward FDI in agriculture and forestry, in particular Gabon, Zambia, Equatorial Guinea, Liberia, the Republic of Congo, and Cameroon. Investments tend to target labour-intensive activities such as logging and wood and rubber processing, usually through joint ventures. In Asia, outward FDI in logging and processing has been directed towards Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Korea, while particular efforts have also been made to establish plantations in border areas previously under opium poppy cultivation in Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. Rubber plantations have been a particular target in Laos, designed to meet the needs for rubber imports for China's growing vehicle industry. Since 2010, China has become the largest importer of DRC timber, responsible for an average of 55% of its forest product exports by value. It's hard to pinpoint China-linked actors in forestry in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as they do not identify themselves as such in policy dialogue. But the DRC has issued 577 artisanal permits for annual timber cutting, with the sector providing around 90% of DRC timber production. Chinese-linked companies are mainly involved as intermediaries and business partners in the artisanal value chains, often pre-financing logging operations, obtaining licenses, and paying harvesting fees and labourers. In Cameroon, there are at least 19 Chinese-owned enterprises and 14 economic operators in partnership with Chinese companies operating in the logging sector. Sudcam, owned by the Chinese company SIno-US and involved in forest clearing, planting and processing of rubber, is just one example. But the country is littered with smaller Chinese-owned sawmills and other companies that are partners with Cameroonian state-owned enterprises, providing funding rather than direct management. It is estimated that Chinese firms control around 1 million hectares of forest across the country. 14 communal forests out of 36 in the whole country have signed notarized partnerships with Sino-Asian companies. There's a lot of hidden statistics that we don't get to see here as well, because there is a lot of illegal activity that I should point out is illegal activity by people who live in the countries. So, for example, Laos gangsters controlling illegal exports to China, and Chinese companies just end up being the recipients. They don't really check their supply chains, they don't really care where the wood comes from. Just to note that there is a whole hidden sector of the economy here, a whole bunch of statistics, a whole lot of money and land, and in this case wood, that we're not discussing because we don't have the figures, but it does exist and it does have an impact. So again, it's not just about market share or explicitly what China controls. It's also about investment. It's also about taking an interest in the development of these industries at the base level in these countries where China can just pump in money or do joint ventures or participate in activities under the guise of Belt and Road. And if you hear me say the words Belt and Road at any point, just take that as a catch-all term for increasing foreign direct investment by Chinese, mainly state-owned firms, but also private firms and also banks since 2013. That's all that means. I do have another episode on the Belt and Road project in China, what it means, how it works, how it operates. So If you're interested in that, you can go and listen to that, and that will give you a lot more detail. But for the purposes of this episode, that's what that means. China is making products, it's manufacturing goods that it then exports to consumers around the world, whether that be individual consumers or other businesses. So that's why China is the largest importer. So if you say introduce very high tariffs, or if you banned completely the export of certain goods to China, then you might see a knock-on effect in places that you didn't expect further down the economic chain. Okay, last bit, I promise, and then I will release you back to your friends and family. So part 1.5, we're talking about oil production. Oil is arguably the most important industry in the world, mainly for geopolitical reasons as opposed to actual reasons. But as we all know, control over oil, investment in oil, access to oil has been the cause of several major conflicts around the world, continuing and everlasting, and definitely not instigated by one country in particular that will remain nameless. Even though China produces more natural gas than it does oil, I chose oil for this last section because it is more contentious and political, and it is, I think, a better indicator of China's increasing importance in the global economy and how that rubs up against this country that is very big and very important and likes to start wars and shall remain nameless. So China is ranked 7 in the world for its own oil production and 2nd in the world for its consumption of crude oil. Like with the case of food and fish and wood, China is actually the largest importer of oil in the world, and it overtook the US in 2017. Like everybody else, China gets most of its oil from Saudi Arabia and Russia, but in recent years, again, like everybody else, it's been trying to diversify its supply chains. And it doesn't just want to make its own supply, but it also wants to have control over other people's supply, again, like a few other countries that shall remain nameless. Another thing that China wants to be able to do is to export to other Asian countries. So it doesn't just want to have control over what it receives, it wants to have a bit more of a say in what other countries receive as well. China's range of oil sources is an international endeavour, says Erica Downs, a fellow at the Centre on Global Energy Policy and senior research scholar at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. There's a big effort, a 2-decade effort on the part of China to diversify not just its oil import suppliers, but also its oil import routes. There's definitely a view in Beijing and the government's oil companies that diversity of suppliers and delivery routes is a way to enhance oil supply security. China had the 2nd largest refining capacity in the world and is responsible for 16% of the world's refinery throughput, just after the US, which accounts for 20%. One of the reasons China has increased oil imports and refining capacity is to sell to other nations, particularly in Asia. According to Ward, they're finding that they're making money producing products and selling it to Asia, so it makes sense to buy, store, refine, and sell. So in China, there are what's known as like the 3 big oil companies. They are Sinopec, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, which we're going to call CNOOC, and the CNPC group. So Sinopec and CNPC are mainly domestic. They do have some projects overseas, but CNOOC is the main sort of like joint venture China going outward company example that we have for oil. So I'm going to run through some of the investments that they've made just to give you an idea of what the capacity that they have some control over is. You can also visit their website, which has a lot more detail on all of these things. But I was quite surprised to see that China was so involved with oil, because it's not something that we really talk about that much, really. Do you think a certain country that shall not be named would be talking about this way more often than they are? So in 2013, CNOOC acquired Canadian oil and gas company Nexen for $15 billion, which at the time was China's largest ever foreign acquisition. The company has interests in the UK North Sea, the United States, and offshore West Africa. CNOOC owns a 50% stake in PAEG, which is the largest private oil company in Argentina, 100% working interest in deep water exploration blocks in the Mexican Gulf, and in the Middle East and Africa, it has interest in exploration fields in Senegal, Algeria, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo. It's also developing a bunch of new oil fields across Nigeria, which of course is one of the most oil-rich countries in the world. Apparently, China's reliance on oil is decreasing with the continued investment in clean energies and the sort of mineral operations that we discussed earlier. But just because growth is slowing doesn't mean that there's no demand. If anything, demand is steady. And I think oil in general will continue to be an important factor as long as most of us don't have electric cars, which I don't have an electric car, so oil is very important to me, at least. And a lot of these operations aren't very big, but it just goes to show that China appears in unexpected places. I would say if you didn't read about these things, if you don't really think about these things a lot, you might not know that China has controlling operating stakes in Canadian oil companies, even in American oil companies. You might think that they're all home-owned, homegrown, etc. I don't know, check the label next time you look at a product that you have lying around. Obviously, a lot of the things that we own are made in China, but just have a think about the supply chains behind that as well. And when somebody says something to you like, well, we can just get them from, I don't know, that company down the road that makes its own bees. It's its own apiary, it produces its own honey and things like that. Just double check whether or not China has like a controlling stake or like a Chinese state-owned enterprise has like a joint venture with them or something like that. The results may surprise you. Okay, so my final word for this episode. I came across, while I was doing all my research, this article from the Carnegie Endowment titled How to De-risk Green Technology Supply Chains from China Without Risking Climate Catastrophe. And it was the first article that I've seen about the idea of de-risking that was completely honest, I guess, or transparent about how de-risking from China is actually a little bit more complicated than just moving this bit over here or something like that. So it says the US and the EU can leverage and expand their foreign financing to bolster supply chain security and reduce China's dominant role in extraction across the global south. Many countries that will be vital to green tech supply chains are currently under debt stress and risk becoming merely sources of raw materials that benefit little from extractivist economic models. Enabling countries in the global south to take full advantage of the green transition to build out their economies will make them less dependent on China while making supply chains more resilient. And I just thought it was funny how it's only just now in 2024 that certain people are putting forward the idea that, hey, maybe in order to encourage people to move their supply chains around China, we should offer them value. Like, we shouldn't just extract from them, we should actually, I don't know, help them develop their economies or make them less reliant on us and more of an equal trading partner. You know, the things that China's been doing for the past decade. Like, they literally have the line in this article. Moreover, the United States and Europe should also leverage their positions with leading multilateral development banks to champion a comprehensive reform of the global financial system to mobilize the finances needed. So it's just like, you mean what the China Development Bank has been doing? Basically. It's just really funny, like, how the tables have turned. We used to accuse China of copying us, and now here we are copying their global going out strategy and Belt and Road, basically. Anyway, that is it for part 1, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one. Please follow me on Substack. And as you can probably hear, I'm a little bit ill as well, but otherwise you would not be getting any episodes until after Christmas. You know, this is my hobby, guys. I've got like a house and a job and a child and a marriage to maintain. So just be patient, bear with me. Hopefully the other episodes will come out before Christmas. If not, I'll see you in the new year. But yeah, thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.